Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thanks for joining us. Our guest today is Lace Padilla from the University of California Merced. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
So before we talk about our topic, it would be nice if you could tell the listeners, I don't even know where you are in California. I guess I could have checked Google before hitting record. Maybe talk about your University of California branch and what you teach, a little bit about your research background. That would be helpful.
Sure. So the University of California Merced is in the Central Valley in California, and we are the newest UC in the system, which is really fantastic because it gives us lots of opportunities to teach new things in innovative ways because we're trying to do things a little bit differently at this newly founded university. And I am an assistant professor in the Cognitive and Information Sciences department, and I teach a variety of things. One class in particular is Judgment and Decision Making, which is an undergraduate level class. And then I also teach a graduate level course called Global Good Studio. And the goal of Global Good Studio is to use data analytics and data science to solve large-scale world problems. And it can seem like a big task for students, but honestly, many of the students that have taken the class have done fantastic work where they actually have helped move the needle in some problems. One example is last semester we had students who found ways to categorize disinformation spread or misinformation about COVID-19 using data science methods, and they recently published that work. So it's a very fun class, and it really ties in what I study, which is uncertainty communication, how people understand information with uncertainty. That's my specialization.
And that is why I wanted to get in touch with you, because I think that uncertainty is a bigger than average issue right now in our classrooms. Are we going to stay hybrid or go all remote again? What's going to happen in the spring semester? Just around the pandemic, in addition to all of the other pieces of will be United States centric. I predict other parts of the world are also dealing with the pandemic, but issues related to the election and institutional racism conversation. So I certainly feel like there's more uncertainty than usual. And I thought maybe you could talk about how your knowledge of that informs the way that you teach, and maybe some things that might be helpful for how faculty should be thinking about the role that uncertainty is playing in our students' lives right now.
Sure. As you just mentioned, as faculty, we feel the massive amount of uncertainty in the world every day. It can feel like almost every decision we have to make in the immediate future and long-term planning for courses and so forth is very uncertain. So it's hard to know how to proceed. And the truth is that the feeling of uncertainty is very cognitively demanding. It takes up a lot of working memory, and it makes us feel anxious and unsettled. We all know that, right? And so in the classroom, considering how students are under such a massive amount of uncertainty, one of the tools or the methods that I've tried to employ based on my research is finding ways to reduce uncertainty in the classroom. And there's so much uncertainty in their daily lives. They certainly don't need more just based on the way that classes are organized. So what I like to do is, specifically for undergraduate classes, do everything in my ability to reduce ambiguity. There's different types of uncertainty, and the one that really pertains to students in a classroom is ambiguity. And, another approach to think about this is sometimes ambiguity is good, where you want people in an assignment, for an example, to be able to take different paths or kind of decide for this themselves, do critical thinking, that type of thing. which is very good. I don't disagree with that approach. But I think particularly in these uncertain times, if we can modify some of the assignments or some of the instruction to reduce ambiguity, I think it's really smart right now, just to help students, deal with all of their personal and life and academic responsibilities. So for me, that looks online. What that takes the form of is for every assignment, I have a full written assignment plus a rubric that I just show students. I don't keep it hidden how they're going to be evaluated. And then I add a video tutorial walking through the assignment. So if they have any other questions about it, they can watch that tutorial and reflect on what I've said in addition to what's there. And then we also talk about it in discussion. So there's lots of uncertainty reduction techniques I'm using just to make it crystal clear what their expectations are to reduce uncertainty.
So this is not the semester to have pop quizzes be 100% of their grade, is your suggestion? Okay,
exactly. And things, there's lots of different types of assignments that have inherent uncertainty. Group work, right? You don't know what the other people in your group are going to do. That's pretty hard. I love group work as just a teaching tool, evaluation metric, but that can be really hard right now because having the uncertainty of maybe someone's family member gets sick in your group. What do you do? And then does your grade depend on the lack of work that student did because that other person has uncertainty? So, I think what I've been doing is just kind of systematically trying to reduce those cases where more uncertainty could pop in.
Great. So that feels pretty concrete and doable. And certainly you can always make adjustments. If when you listen to this podcast, you realize, I've been quite uncertain dependent in this class. There's still time probably for most everyone to make an edit for your spring courses. Maybe we can switch gears a little bit too. I didn't know about that class you teach on big ideas. And I agree that sounds intimidating, but how do you sort of walk students through what they need in order to start to tackle a big idea? Because that has some level of uncertainty too, right? There's a lot of, how do you even choose what big thing you want to try to tackle? So maybe you could spend a few minutes just telling us a little more about that class, because I do like the idea that students come out of my courses not just with information, but really practical and applicable things to work on.
Yes. So that course has uncertainty built into it. And I developed it, of course, before the pandemic. So we're having to kind of reevaluate how that functions because of all the uncertainty. But the goal was to teach people data science skills, but start with a project that they care about. And, all of my research I do because I want to help people in the world. That's why I do science. And I thought it would be fun to have that be the primary goal for all of the students. So they felt like what they were doing in the classroom had direct ramifications in the world that they want to live in. And so what we do, the way to actually enact that is there's usually about 15 students in the course, and they're from a wide range of disciplines in cognitive science, applied math, computer science. And we kind of make a vision board of all of the big global problems. And we're talking, climate change, socioeconomic problems, the heavy hitters, right? The things that students really care about. And we kind of brainstorm on what all of those problems are, and then see if we can group them into general topics of interest. And when we do that, we start to see some natural aligning of different students' interests with different particular projects. So then the students break up into groups based on their interests, and they do this sort of skills evaluation of the different skills that each person in the group has. And then they also indicate what they would like to learn, what are the skills that they would like to develop in that course. And then using that information, they decide on a project where they both capitalize on their current skills and can develop the new skills that they're interested in, with the sole mission of trying to help people in the world in some way. And they do that for half a semester. And then at the end of the project, they have a public communication component. That's the actual evaluation, where they have to communicate what they've done to the world. That takes a variety of different forms. Sometimes it's publications, sometimes it's blog posts, sometimes it's presentations to the public, sometimes it's information graphic. It comes in a lot of forms. The goal is really just to take what they've done and make sure it actually has an impact in some capacity. And it's been very successful so far. It's very uncertain, as you can imagine, because all of the goals are set by the students and they're evaluated entirely on how effectively they achieved the goals that they set for themselves. So it's a little different than normal classes in that way. And then the other cool component of it is for the second project, I bring in industry and government agency partners. And if they want to, students can work on a project that is in collaboration with some industry partners. So this last semester, we had students working with USRA, which is the University Research Association connected with NASA, and they did a project trying to better identify methods for flood impacts in certain areas based on satellite data and a new technology that the group developed, which turned into internships, and they're actually going to implement the results of the project in the company that we were working with. So it's fun, lots of different options, but it's very uncertain. So I'll have to evaluate how I'm going to adapt to that in the future.
Thank you. That's so many cool outcomes. It sounds like something right out of what your alumni magazine. I can already see the spread of the about this exciting assistant professor and the work in the classroom translating into the real world and students getting placements, and is also just so consistent with the APA learning goals for the undergraduate major. You're doing so much of that. So thank you for sharing that. That gives me some ideas as a basic experimental cognitive psychologist. Sometimes I need to remember that there's a world outside of my lab in the classrooms that some of this can be really helpful to do.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you were hoping to tell our listeners about your work in uncertainty, or just about, for those of us that have been around for a long time, things that we should know about being an assistant professor right now that would be helpful, that might reduce your uncertainty in your role, or any other teaching ideas?
Well, I mean, I think the most important finding from my research is that the way that information, not just uncertainty, but the way that information is presented has a profound influence on our judgments in the world. And that applies to the classroom as well. Well, the way that you present data to people can influence the conclusions that they make about data. If you think about something simple that we use in psychology all the time, like error bars, the way that we visually represent error bars, not the statistics, just the way we draw them in a figure or on a slide, can have drastic implications on the conclusions people make. So there's different approaches that can help people, students in particular, understand that information better. And the key principle to think about when representing information is that the people in your classroom are going to range significantly in their graph literacy skills. And we hope that students at some point were taught how to read graphs, but even with education, there's a wide range of how effectively people understand graphs. And there's some graphs that are easier for people to understand even with low graph literacy. In particular, if you take error bars, which are ranges from 95% confidence interval, it's an interval. And the issue is that interval hides important features of the distribution of information. So rather than showing an error bar, if you can show what's called a violin plot, which actually shows the distribution, it's more intuitive to people that there is a distribution under the interval. What happens when you see an interval is your mind creates a cognitive category and it says, this information in the interval is fundamentally different than information outside of the interval. But as we all know, confidence intervals are kind of an arbitrary cutoff that we decide as scientists are meaningful. But when we make that interval, rather than communicating to someone, it's a range of a distribution, people see it as a chunk of data. And it can lead to some misunderstandings about what the data actually means, particularly for individuals with low graph literacy. So this is kind of my pitch to think deeply about the way that you're presenting your data in a classroom to ensure that everyone can understand it as easily and effectively as possible. And if you want some guidelines on best practices for information communication, I'm happy to pass along some great papers, some books. You can always check out my website too that has kind of a wealth of knowledge on uncertainty visualization, which is what we communicate a lot in science. It's interesting because when you hear uncertainty communication, you might think, oh, some like complex statistic. But uncertainty is error bars. It is intervals. We're showing uncertainty around a mean estimate in some cases. So the complex visualization of uncertainty actually applies to some of the most basic plots and graphs that we use every day in psychology.
Wow, that's really something right. And that I was like, oh, I'm just like thinking about all of my slides and perhaps a consequence of this, like you're saying, like we make these categories without talking about the variability within them. In some ways, might that have the effect on some students if they, don't have the personal experience of whatever you're showing the graph to depict? That's in some ways allows you to kind of discredit the result, right? Like, well, you're saying that, people that X should be higher, I'm lower, therefore your result seems not correct, right? That we already kind of have a self-bias to what we've experienced. So I'm wondering if really putting that out front, like, no, this is just what the average, as my colleague Susan Nolan likes to say, right? She always says the average result of this is this, not the individual results. Do students seem to do a little better job with nuance when you give them that sort of the variability piece? I assume that this is also part of not just for my papers, but for when I'm teaching.
So I think, and I'm a little biased because I study visualizations, but I think what happens is anytime you add nuance or sort of qualifying information, it's not as powerful as the visual information. As you know, our visual system is one of the most powerful processing mechanisms that we have. And so when you represent something visually, it really gets ingrained in how people think about it. So if you want someone to interpret it differently in a nuanced way, you absolutely have to change the visualization. Like we've done work, and there's various papers where you take a figure and you add a caption to it. Well, people aren't going to read the caption. They're just going to take away the information in the picture. And it's really to say that visuals, images, really have a strong hold on our interpretation of information. And we see this with how much visualizations are being used in the news today to present COVID-19 information or to present statistics about elections. They do that because they know that the way that they present that information visually will override any other information that is subsequent to it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of ways to represent information that manipulates the way that people think about it. Really simple ways that if you're an informed information consumer, you would know that that's an issue. For example, you see people truncating the y-axis. And unless you're paying close attention, you might not notice that the Y starts at 50 rather than 0. And then it would magnify difference between two groups, for example. There's, lots of ways that that's done. And you see it done a lot in politics and a lot in advertising to try to influence you to make a judgment or buy a product because of the way that it's hard to say misrepresenting, but they're using the tools of visualization to lead you to the conclusions that they want you to draw. And it's honestly a little bit of a scary time to not be an informed information consumer, because so much of what we get is online and in visualizations. If you're not paying attention, someone is trying to lead you to the conclusion that they would like you to have. And, it's interesting when I tell people about this, because we know this with words, right? We're taught that the way that you construct a sentence or the way that you phrase information really influences what people think. We've known about priming for so long. This same thing happens with visualizations, and we're just learning the ramifications with the rise of social media and access to visualizations. But it really has a similar type of effect to phrasing and grammar and priming. All of that stuff happens within visualizations, but we're just less aware of it because we haven't been explicitly trained to identify some of those manipulations. I could talk about this forever.
I know. I'm like, so captivating. And now I'm going to pay so much more attention to my, I always talk about the picture superiority effect, but you're right. I've never really thought about the consequence of that for misinformation. And maybe I should have been studying visual memory illusions this whole time because I might be able to find even stronger effects. So now I have things to think about in my classroom and in my laboratory. Thank you for this. This was a really great conversation. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a great time.